Do you feel stuck, depressed, lost, disconnected? Whose fault is it? Is it your fault? Is it because of the pandemic? Or is the pandemic merely increasing what the establishment long ago started?
According to a U.S. Census Bureau report, now more than 1 in 3 Americans are reporting anxiety and depression symptoms. Compare that to 1 in 10 at roughly this time last year.
I think if the problems are created systemically, then the solutions must also be systemic. When something reaches endemic proportions, it can no longer be blamed on the individual.
A study done in the UK found an increase in mental distress, again, year to date versus 1 year ago. That was published in The Lancet. And particularly vulnerable, according to that report, women, teenagers, those with preschool-aged children seeing the highest rates of anxiety and depression.
Wow. A poll by a mental health foundation found that over 1 in 5 UK adults have felt panicked and hopeless. 3 in 10 felt afraid of the coronavirus pandemic, with experts saying it could cause suicide rates to soar. More than a third of young people have lost hope over future aspirations due to the pandemic. And more personally, I've noticed that the comments of some of the videos that we have made are like heartbreaking. May Earn said, "I've been the loneliest I've ever been in my life for the past 5-6 years. This pandemic has made my already terrible loneliness and isolation devastating. It's not fun. It feels like psychological torture. I'm convinced it is." Shauna Starr says, "It's really lonely at my house. I'm single, live with my 2 teenage daughters. We stay home all the time. So many things in our world right now seem so depressing and hopeless." Destination Money wrote, "My 9-year-old niece wrote on a piece of paper that her life is falling apart and that she is depressed and she just looks at screens all day." So whether we're talking about children or adults, just from the comments on my content, it's clear that there is tremendous suffering everywhere.
According to Deloitte's annual millennial survey out today, about 2/3 of millennials and Gen Zs say they, quote, often worry or get stressed about their financial situation. Younger generations are reporting higher job losses, less financial optimism, and changing views of the workplace during the pandemic.
Like, if that's what your hope is predicated on, work, job, profit, then how are you going to be happy? That's not a good idea that we've been sold. I was sold the same idea. I thought that's what I was supposed to be doing. And I've learned again and again that these are not successful techniques for dealing with reality, your inner reality, or even your outer reality. Of course, in a financially motivated system, it's better to have money because it means you're not exposed to the torture of poverty and the shame of poverty, which I have known in my life. But the reality is it's the system itself that's problematic rather than any individual suffering within it.
The coronavirus may be new, but it's triggering something downright primal in many of us.
It is triggering something downright primal. Yes, fear, dread, alienation, loss. Have you read that book Tribe by Sebastian Junger? He says, humans don't mind hardship. In fact, they thrive in it. What they mind is not feeling necessary. Modern society has perfected the art of making people not feel necessary. No less a thinker than Karl Marx said in his book, and I'm not obviously saying why don't we all become communist in a state way like in China or the Soviet Union. I'm saying that Marxism is a critical device for looking at the flaws of capitalism is very interesting, particularly his observation that when we become little more than components in an economic machine, palliated through the offerings of consumerism, we will experience alienation. And I think that this alienation has merely been increased and highlighted and heightened by the pandemic rather than created by it. What the pandemic has revealed is that we're living lives that are disconnected from purpose and meaning. What are your values and what is your value? What is your life about? We've given the time now to confront the reality that our lives essentially are just to make contributions to a system that doesn't really value us. It's exposed something. It's exposed a loneliness and an emptiness, a loss of power and a loss of purpose. I think of this somewhat from a spiritual perspective, but you can also look at it from an anthropological one. What are we evolved to do? We are evolved to survive and cooperate in small social groups where we care for one another and where we are embedded in nature, where we are acknowledged that we are part of nature. And for thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, we retained rituals that reminded us of our connection to nature. The remnants of this are still with us in our holidays that chime with solstices and various other natural events, but that now seem abstract. I'm fortunate to live in a rural environment where, for good or for ill, nature is felt. When it snows or when it floods, you feel it upon you. Many people, most people now live in cities, and a city really exchanges entertainment for crowded conditions, stimulation for living in small spaces denied access to nature. I've lived in cities most of my life, but I think the city, in a sense, is the primary creation, the key creation, the defining creation of a culture which is now rampantly out of control, whether we're talking about economic and financial chaos, or at least lack of regulation, or a set of objectives that are entirely detached from who we really are. I'm not surprised to learn that young people feel lost and alienated because they are growing up, reaching adulthood in conditions where they're already experiencing the promises of the society they're inheriting can never be fulfilled. The lifestyles that you may aspire to as a result of the images you receive through social media are unobtainable. It's clear now that what you're being offered is a life of sustenance and subsistence, a life of consuming products that might provide you with a temporary thrill, that invite you to stay in a state of stimulation online, blank, staring at a screen, detached and distracted from who you really are and what your life really means. When are you again going to experience true ecstasy, the joy, the glory of being alive? And your very depression is an indication that there is some part of your soul that knows that you are not living in alignment with your inheritance, your birthright. You are being portioned off into a life without meaning and value, when alternatives, when glorious options are available that you are being cut off from and denied. Mark Fisher, one of my favourite thinkers, God rest his soul, sadly he's no longer with us, because he points out continually that mental health crisis does not happen in a vacuum or a bubble. It happens as a result of social, economic and political systems. The mental health plague, says Fisher, in capitalist societies would suggest that instead of being the only social system that works, capitalism is inherently dysfunctional, and that the cost of it appearing to work is very high. We're ultimately primates that are evolved to live in small groups, to form a certain number of alliances. We've wandered a long way from home, both literally and metaphysically and spiritually, and we need to find our way back. We need to discover some shared values. We need to discover a way that we can live in harmony with one another, perhaps not side by side, perhaps in our own groups, in our own self-governing democratic groups. Furthermore, Fisher said, in entrepreneurial fantasy societies, the delusion is fostered that anyone can be like Bill Gates. Never mind that the actual likelihood of this occurring has diminished since the 1970s. A person born in 1958 was more likely than one born in 1970 to achieve upward mobility through education, for example. The selfish capitalist toxins that are most poisonous to well-being are the systemic encouragement of the ideas that material affluence is the key to fulfillment, that only the affluent are winners, and that access to the top is open to anyone willing to work hard enough, regardless of their familial, ethnic or social background. If you do not succeed, there is only one person to blame: you. That's why you're depressed. That's why you're unhappy. That's why you feel disconnected, because you are being personally blamed for the failings of a system designed to keep you trapped in those feelings of failure, and that is being magnified now that an out of control pandemic is positing millions and millions of people in cells of self-reflection, forced to confront the reality of our lives now, lives devoid of meaning. That is what our system does. It extracts us from ourselves. It extracts us from the natural world, inner and outer, and deposits us in a dystopia where we have no choice but to consume and blindly obey.
There are steps that we can all take at home, regardless of how we're doing. Number one, this is something that we are all facing, so recognize we are not alone here.
MX Jarrow goes, one of the things I've noticed during this lockdown is how governments have ignited one of humans' greatest fears, social disapproval. People are now terrified about how people will view them if they do not conform to the restrictions. This is a perfect control tactic. People police themselves. Anyone who now speaks up against restrictions is instantly labelled a granny killer or an anti-vaxxer. Practical and fair debates are now nothing more than old relics. You're either blue or red. This polarisation is destroying us. It's another consideration, isn't it, during this time, that there is so much shame and inability to communicate, a lack of tolerance for alternative or different views, censorship. All these things are on the rise. All of these things create alienation and create an environment where you don't feel free to communicate openly. Open communication is necessary for good mental health. The ability to have a discourse, to have a debate, to disagree, integral for healthy and thriving societies. All of these things are being foreclosed. I'm very grateful to have access to the channels of communication that I have, and I'm really enjoying having these conversations with you, hearing your comments, hearing how you feel, so that perhaps together we can work to construct alternatives where we can look to traditions, where we can look to the vanguard of modern philosophers and thinkers to create solutions that are outside of the box, because inside of the box is only incarceration. We have to go outside of the box now. We have no choice.
Getting physical activity or some form of exercise for the body also helps the mind. And then things like meditation, very, very important for the spirit.
It is necessary for all of us to acknowledge that there is a spiritual dimension to our lives. Spiritual simply means well-being, the way that we feel. We need to incorporate meditation, prayer, focus, transcendence from our ordinary life, and a recognition that our material life cannot fulfill us. I don't mean that you're not going to have a job or you're not going to work or anything like that. I mean that there is something neglected within us because of the priorities that are pushed upon us by the systems that we live within, that we have to take personal responsibility for awakening simply because no one else is going to awaken it for us.
You want to try to avoid self-medication, however, with things like drugs and alcohol, which is really important. And lastly, if you are struggling, ask for help.
If you are struggling, I've put links in the description to some support groups that may be of use to you. But in my opinion, the real problem is that we live within systems that benefit from the alienation of ordinary people, and the pandemic has merely magnified a pre-existing problem. And it's these systemic problems that need to change. Mental health, loneliness, and a lost generation need to be regarded not as problems that can be solved individually, but problems that have to be solved culturally, socially, and politically. And in order to do that, we will need to engender huge change.